I'm Dean Newlund, and welcome to Leadovation. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. This podcast is dedicated to the art and science of innovative leadership. Through insightful interviews with industry experts, I bring you cutting-edge strategies and experiences of innovative leadership, helping you think differently, act strategically, and achieve remarkable results. Join me as I provide insights and tools that empower you to make smarter decisions, forge meaningful relationships. Welcome to Leadovation. For those of you who haven't tuned in lately, we've changed the name of our podcast from The Business of Intuition to Leadovation. And while intuition will continue to be a key superpower we want to discuss, which we actually do a little bit today in my interview, we have decided to include 3 elements our listeners have been asking for. In a sense, they've been wanting more inspiration and advice on leadership, i.e. being a leader in one's own life and a leader of others' teams and companies. Number 2, innovation, because if we aren't learning faster than our competition, we will fall behind. And 3, what I call intentional, healthy presence in a world where the speed of change is the slowest it will be for the rest of our lives. Yes, that's true. And our brains and nervous systems are not designed to absorb and react to this speed of change. We need to intentionally find ways to be healthy and present so that the journey to success is as important as the destination. Well, in today's world, marked by political divides, social disconnection, and technological disruptions, think about the fact that we are in an election year. We've got ChatGPT changing the way in which we do work. We got people who are in hybrid situations, disconnected in many ways. Leaders and teams face unprecedented pressures leading to widespread burnout and disconnection. The current phase, described in a wonderful book that I'm beginning to read called The Fourth Turning, amplifies these challenges, highlighting the need for authentic, human-centered leadership. To navigate this crisis, leaders should focus on really authenticity, vulnerability, telling the truth, really genuine human connection. Sounds simple, hard to do, but very transformative. Practices such as regular appreciation exercises, personal routines for how you start your day and keeping yourself grounded and in the flow, reflective and reflection activities that can help you build trust and strengthen relationships. By integrating intuition also and flexibility into this approach, leaders can create a more resilient and supportive work environment and be better equipped to handle ongoing and future challenges. My next guest is a wonderful gentleman out of Northern California, the Bay Area. He's written 5 very popular books. His name is Mike Robbins, and he is a leadership expert and the author of books that include the latest, We Are All in This Together, which is also the name of this particular episode. He is a sought-after speaker with such clients as Google, Wells Fargo, Microsoft, Walmart, eBay, and many, many more. He and his work has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. Mr. Mike Robbins on the Leadovation podcast. Well, Mike, it's great to have you on the show. I have to say I'm a bit envious of the fact that you've written as many books as you had or have and still have this thriving practice. I'm finally I'm in the middle of pushing out a book after 30 years. It seems like I've been pregnant for a long time with something that needs to be said. So it's coming here shortly, yes. But I want to hear about some of this stuff. But what we were talking about, before we hit the record button was this interesting book that I've been reading called The Fourth Turning, which this particular researcher has found ways to be able to find patterns in history that have gone back thousands of years based on 20-year increments. And this increment that we're in right now, according to his research, is called a crisis. And, everyone could see, we're probably in some sort of a crisis. When you think about the political divide, social divide, a lot of people don't believe in our politicians anymore. We've got AI that is coming in and creating a whole new disruptive way in which to do work. Managers and leaders within organizations are having to contend with all this. Plus, we've got all these different generations working together at the same time. And then, of course, Vivek Murthy, our current Surgeon General, says that we're all kind of depressed. We need to be more connected to each other and remove the tendency towards isolation. So in that sort of lead in, my friend, what's your take on this crazy world? I mean, you've been at this a long time. I've been at this a long time. We've never seen anything like this before. I mean, what are you
No,
seeing and how are you helping people navigate this crazy time?
I mean, well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show, and I appreciate being able to have this conversation. I mean, I do feel like the word unprecedented gets used over and over again and has been for, the last 5 years. It almost loses its meaning. But I do think we are contending with so many different external factors and have been for the last number of years. Most of the leaders and the teams and the companies that I work with, it's not like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, people weren't tired or burnt out at times, but the level of exhaustion or the level of overwhelm or the level of sort of drinking from the fire hose or whatever cliche or metaphor you want to use is just it's at a fever pitch, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. I mean, is it a little bit better today than it was a couple of years ago when we were like all locked down pandemic? Yeah. But it's still like there's no sense of normalcy that's returned that I can experience personally or that I see. And the thing that so much of my work, Dean, focuses on authenticity and being in the present moment, real and vulnerable about what we're experiencing. And so what I try to help leaders do and teams do as best as I can is with everything coming at us and everything going on, like, even though we're disconnected more so than ever, we're not in the same rooms or the same spaces as much as we used to be. Can we tell the truth about what our real emotional experience is? And can we connect with each other on a human level? At the end of the day, that's kind of what I've always been writing about and speaking about for the last almost 25 years. But I feel like today it's even more important and even more challenging than ever, because I agree with this book you're talking about. It does feel like we're in a phase of crisis, not to be hyperbolic about it, but that does seem to describe what's been going on.
And so if your center of your work or part of your work is around this authenticity, about
Yeah.
being able to be in the moment and tell the truth, that feels right.
Mm,
When I hear you say that, and I think a lot of people listening to this would say that feels right. And yet I have this addictive sort of hamster wheel doer
right.
mechanism that needs me to continue to do more of the same. And so,
Right.
yeah, Mike and Dean, I get it. How? I mean, how do I break the cycle of my doing addict to be able to be more honest, authentic, tell the truth? And is the payoff going to be worth it? Because I feel like I'm drowning, and I feel like if I don't work as hard as I do, I can't support my family. I can't do the work that I need for my team and my company. So it feels like it's a luxury I don't have to be able to tap into.
Yeah, listen, I can relate, even this morning. So like I'm sure many people listening or watching us, I have my own sort of morning routine or personal practices that I like to do just to kind of center myself and take care of myself. And I noticed, I was just saying this to my wife this morning, that something as simple for me, and I'm sure many people can relate with this. I try to keep my phone out of my bedroom when I go to sleep at night. I don't always do it, but that's my intention. And when I can have my phone plugged in my office and then do a few things in the morning that get me grounded and centered, right in my journal and meditate for a little bit, or I even cleaning up the kitchen, I walk outside in my backyard in my bare feet when I'm home. I mean, little things that I do before I pick up my phone and sort of open myself up to the world. It's not only that I feel better, which I do, I notice how much more present, engaged, and focused I am in being able to actually get work done. I've had an incredibly unproductive day today.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it was my phone was next to my bed last night. I woke up early this morning and I picked it up because it was right there. And with all the things happening in the world and what's going on and whatever, I could not somehow manage the addiction that I had to go get on social media and check my email and do the things, like we all do. And it's not, I use that as an example, a very simple but very personal example that I think a lot of people can relate with, that to your point, it's now where we could work all the time, literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and never take a break. And we would never get anywhere close to all the work done. We could also just be engaged in technology and social media and videos on YouTube and, content that's out there in the world. And there's just a never ending supply of it. So it really is that much more important for us to figure out ways individually to discipline ourselves. But again, if you think about teams and leaders, are there ways or mechanisms? And again, it's harder than ever because people are working asynchronously. They're working virtually, they're working hybridly, they're working in different time zones and parts of the world, which is both wonderful that we can work that way, which gives us lots of flexibility, but terrible in terms of us taking care of ourselves and actually connecting with the other human beings. So there really is a level of discipline that it takes for all of us in terms of whatever personal practices that we have, because it's that whole thing of like, I don't have time to take a break, right? I'm too busy. Well, if you keep doing that and keep doing that and keep doing that, eventually like you get hurt or you get sick and you're forced to take a break. So as a metaphor, it's like, what can we do to slow ourselves down in the midst of all the pace that's going on? And there's actually practical ways to do it. You know, you and I both, you probably come in like I do, and it's an offsite, it's a retreat, and I get together with, and no one ever has time for those things. I've never once been at a retreat where everyone's like, we didn't have anything in the calendar, so we just scheduled this, right? It's like, no, it's always, even if you do it at the slower time of the year, it's always a terrible time to pull out of work and go for a day or 3 days or whatever. Even if it's just a half a day down the hall in a conference room, no one has time for it. And then usually at the end of those things, some version of, I mean, unless it's a terrible retreat, it's like, oh my gosh, we needed this. Mm-hmm. But you had to force everyone out of it. It's like vacations for a lot of us, those of us who identify as workaholics. It's like, it never really makes sense in the calendar. And then when you do it, you're like, oh my God, I was exhausted. I needed that break, you know?
Yeah. So do you feel that we are running towards something, or are we running away from something? Is this maniacal engine that you just described, is it heading towards something? Is it moving away from something? And I sometimes think it's both.
I think it's both.
But I'm wondering what your thoughts are. And if so, what are we running away from?
Look, I always think most of us as human beings are running away from our feelings. Like we're running away from pain. We're running away from fear. Sometimes we're running away from love. I mean, like we're running away from our humanity and the reality that like, we're not going to be here forever. I was at a memorial service over the weekend. The mother of a friend of mine I've known since she was a friend of my sister's, and I've known her since I was a little kid. And I was just sitting around the room, and myself and a bunch of other folks in our 50s who I've known since, again, we were all little kids. And her mom was 85 and died. And I'm just sitting there, like often is the case at a memorial service, and just like, man, what are they going to say about me? You know, and it's hard not to go there and I wasn't freaked out about it, but I remember back to something a mentor of mine said to me, Dean, when I was in my 20s. He's like, Mike, if you live your life more aware of your own death, daily basis, like on a regular basis, you'll live very differently. And so I think we're often running away from that. I think, though, the towards piece, and we have to be mindful because we can just, I think there's that book called A Race to Nowhere, and it's talking about, and this is very present in my life right now, we're raising teenagers, and I've got one about to, one just starting college and one that's in her second year of high school. But it's like, what are we doing? We're forcing these kids, you got to go, you got to get an education. And it's like, for what? What are we doing? But I think when I think about that for myself, it's like, oh, am I really going towards a vision or a possibility or a dream that I have, or that collectively the team that I'm part of has? Or am I just trying to get to the next level or the next benchmark or the next thing? And as someone who's been aware of my own obsession with achievement, I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, so I'm oriented around performance and achievement. But I have to be really careful because it could just be the next thing for the sake of the next thing. And all of us have had that experience. You get to the next thing and you're like, well, this sucks. Oh, it must be the next thing. Yeah. And then this sucks. So it's the next thing. And then you realize there's no next thing that's going to actually make me fulfilled. Yeah. So it comes back to like, am I living some sense of purpose? Am I actually trying to develop that sense of fulfillment? Or am I just simply trying to accomplish the next thing? And, I think that's a lifelong journey for most of us to pay attention to.
You mentioned purpose, and you also brought up the concept of death.
Mm-hmm.
I know that they can be very mutually exclusive, and they can also be connected.
Yeah.
Do we need a philosophy around death? Can you come to terms with it either on the standpoint of, hey, my spiritual practice, my religious beliefs are that when you die, and it's lights out and that's it, right? We're done. End of story. Right. Or there are others who would say, no, we're going to have a reincarnated experience, or we're going to return to some sort of higher place. We're going to see God. We're going to do all sorts of other things that others may have another part of opinion on. But is no philosophy about death part of the problem? Meaning, like, do we need to sort of identify, hey, you know what? Everybody's got a series of issues to deal with. One of them we all have to deal with is coming to terms with death. And if you don't deal with that, you have a reactive behavior, which could be what we were just describing.
I think what's interesting, I mean, I think there's two parts to your question. The way I see it is, on the one hand, we don't do a very good job dealing with death, talking about death, facing death, especially in our American Western society. It is not part of the conversation. It is seen as bad and something to avoid, and it's a failure in medicine. And it, this weird sense of, and I lost both my parents and my sister. A dear friend, mentor of mine many years ago, when he was even younger than I am now, died very suddenly. So I've had quite a bit of personal experience with death and loss and grief, which were very painful experiences, but I'm actually really grateful to have had those experiences. Not grateful that those people died, of course, but grateful that I was forced to really face some of that at quite a young age, because it did take me to a place that I wouldn't have gone to otherwise. And what I learned in that process was like, oh yeah, we don't do a very good job dealing with death or grief or talking about it or thinking about it. And then the piece about what happens after, or what do we believe from a spiritual perspective? I mean, I sort of feel like, look, whether you believe that nothing happens and it's over, or you're very clear that there's all of this afterlife, in some ways, not that it doesn't matter, it clearly matters, but in either case, physical life will end. And this journey that we're on, in the way that we understand it, is finite. And that's as simple of an idea as that is, that's one that I don't think we grapple with very well. I had another mentor of mine years ago say to me, Mike, you're living your life as though you're trying to survive it. And I said, yeah, so? And he said, you have to remember something really important. I said, what's that? He said, nobody ever has. And I was like, what? He said, the mortality rate is holding strong at 100%. Like, you're not getting out of this thing alive, but you're stressing out about every decision and worried about screwing up and worried about what this person thinks and that person. He's like, it's totally normal and human. It's a problem. So can you somehow figure out how to not be stuck in that paradigm all the time? And it was, when he said this to me, I had a really hard time with it, but it was an important conversation for me. And I think about that now when I get stressed out, or I'll bring this up when I'm working with teams or I'm working with companies. And unless I'm working with people inside of healthcare, where they literally are dealing with people's lives and death, most of the time I will say, and I could be sitting in a room with the CEO of a big tech company and it's usually him, right? His or her leadership team. And it's like, what they're doing is important. And there's millions, if not billions of dollars on the line. But it's like, hey, first of all, this is not life or death. And second of all, everyone in this room is eventually going to die. And like, not again to be hyperbolic about it, but like, let's just take it down a notch or two if we can, and see like, what's the next right thing to do.
Have you actually discussed death in your facilitations with teams?
Yes. And I'm always mindful, because what I've found over the years, Dean, about this is when you start to talk about death or loss, and I'm pretty open with, in my work, I share a lot about myself and my life, not just to be self-referential. It's just kind of the way I'm the kind of person, like, whenever I tried to tell my girls stories when they were little, it would always end up being stories about me. But like, I could never write fiction. Like, all my writing is always nonfiction. It's usually very first person narratives, because that's the way I see the world, is through my own experience. And I've always been a believer of like, the more personal, the more universal. And the more willing we are to tell our real story and our real experience, mindful of we're telling it to other people, they'll be able to relate. And when I talk about my own experience with loss, with grief, or with death, what I notice is a lot of people have a lot of unhealed grief. And so it can bring up so much emotion that takes people over, that I'm really mindful of when I talk about it and how I talk about it. And it's pretty heavy, right? It's not, I get brought in a lot of times as a motivational speaker, and here we go, let's talk about death. But in some ways, I do feel like it's important as a reminder, and I will bring it up, not to manipulate people's feelings, but just as a, hey, let's kind of put this all into context here.
Yeah.
And I do feel like one of the many things, and everyone listening, obviously everyone listening to us right now, we're all still alive. So that's a good thing. And all of us have dealt with or been somewhere close to, connected to someone who died. And maybe you've been fortunate enough in your life that it hasn't been anyone really close to you, a spouse or a family member, a parent or a sibling, but it will eventually. And so when those things happen, though, what I realize for myself is they're often incredible wake-up calls for all of like, wait a minute, what's important? Even just sitting at my friend's mother's memorial the other day, it's like, wait, I'm forced to stop and reflect on my own life and what matters to me. And I do feel like, as weird as it might seem to think about this in the business context, it is important. And one of the ways I'll talk about it in a less heavy way is just like, so-and-so gets a job at another company, or they're going to leave, and we find we're heartbroken because, oh no, they're leaving. And what do? We go and tell them how much we appreciate them and how great they are and how much we're going to miss, and that you've made such a difference. A lot of my work, in addition to focusing on authenticity, has focused on appreciation. And so my challenge to everyone is like, let's not wait until they're retiring or they're leaving the company or there's a big reorg or they get laid off. Like, let's tell each other now. Because that's also another one of my inquiries whenever I sit at a memorial service like I did last weekend, is like, did we tell her when she was alive? Or are we all now just talking about her in the past tense? And some of the sadness and some of the grief is like, oh, I should have let them know. But we have that opportunity every single day. Like, everyone listening to us right now, you could literally send a text message or make a phone call or have a conversation with someone in your life, either at home or at work, letting them know how much you appreciate them. And if you do that from your heart, I promise you, even if it's a little awkward and a little vulnerable at first, they will not be upset or offended. Even if it's a little emotionally awkward, they will appreciate it. I promise.
It's interesting you say that, Mike. I was over, my wife and I, who also works in the business, we went to this coaching in healthcare and leadership conference over at Harvard about, 8 weeks ago. And that was one of the exercises that they all had us do was, all right, everybody take 10 minutes or 5 minutes and just send a text to somebody that you probably would like to share some appreciation to. And it just changed the room. We had 800 people, and all of a sudden, all these texts started coming back.
Of course.
And
right?
You could see in people's faces the reaction, even though you didn't know who they were. You just could see that, oh, wow, everyone's looking down at their phones and getting in this nice little endorphin hit.
It's great, right? And it's so simple, and like, we all know it. And again, if you're listening to a show like this is not news to you. This is not like, but a lot of things in life, Dean, I believe, again, go back to, like, I'm a former athlete, so I think of things a lot in terms of practice.
What was yours?
And training. So I played baseball. I got drafted out of high school by the Yankees. I didn't sign with the Yankees because I got a chance to play baseball in college at Stanford. And then I got drafted by the Kansas City Royals out of Stanford and played pro baseball for a few years until, unfortunately, I got injured. I was a pitcher and I tore ligaments in my elbow when I was still in the minor leagues. But I started baseball at 7. I got hurt at 23 and finally retired at 25 after 3 surgeries on my pitching arm. So 18 of the first 25 years of my life, I played baseball. And I wasn't the biggest and the strongest and the most talented, but I worked really hard. And I learned in that process, and baseball is a sport that some people think is really boring and they don't like to watch. There's a lot of failure in baseball. And so I learned how to lose. I learned how to fail. Not that I liked it, but I also learned that, like, if you're going to get better, it's about training. It's about practice. It's about rituals. And so that's kind of, even at 50 years old now, half a lifetime since I played, that's still kind of baked into how I think and operate. And when I think about gratitude or appreciation, it's like, I can love my wife. I can love our daughters. I can really love and appreciate my friends and my team members and people around me. And if I don't let them know, it doesn't make me bad, wrong, evil, terrible, but it's like I'm missing out on this incredible opportunity that's not only, and you saw it at that conference you were at, it's not only a gift for them that when we give it to them, it's a gift for us when we take the time just to give it. Yeah. It's just like when you give someone a present for their birthday or the holidays, like, you're as excited about giving them the gift as they are about receiving it, usually, especially if it's a really good gift. And the thing about appreciation, I often say this sort of jokingly, but seriously when I'm speaking about this, and this is true in all my years of talking about and researching and writing and speaking about appreciation, I've talked to so many people around the world about this and heard lots of different thoughts and feedbacks and insights and questions, and it changes culture. One thing I've never heard anyone say in my entire life, Dean, is, you know what, Mike, I'm just too appreciated. It's just too much. I wish my coworkers and my friends and my family and just, knock it off. It's too much. No, I mean, look, we sometimes get overwhelmed in the moment if we're getting a lot of, like, it's our birthday or it's a big thing. But there's no sense of, like, over appreciating someone if we do it genuinely.
Yeah.
And it's such a powerful practice. And back to the question you asked earlier about teams and leaders right now, like, that's one of my favorite exercises to do with teams, in person, virtually. And I've done this for years. And again, it seems a little corny and cheesy at first. Every single time I do this, it is literally just, it shifts not only the room, but the relationships. And I call it the appreciation seat. and we sit in a room. If I've got a really big group, I'll put them in small groups. If we're on Zoom, we can do it on Zoom. I mean, you can do this anywhere, but we literally go around and we'll go, okay, Dean is going to start. He's on the appreciation seat. And what that means is for the next 2 minutes, anyone who feels moved to, we're just going to express some appreciation for him. And Dean, your only job is just receive the appreciation. And people squirm in their seat and they get weird. But once we move through the awkwardness at first, I usually use the timer on my phone just because I've done this long enough to know, unless we really have a couple of hours to do it, but what happens is people just start they thank each other for stuff. They share stuff. And whether they've worked together for a long time or they're just coming together newly, this works whether it's a new team and a reorg and people are literally just meeting for the first time, or they've been working together for a long time, or they've just been through some horrendous thing, or it doesn't matter. I've seen so many tears and so many hugs and so many oh my gosh. And part of the magic of it is we do it. We go around the whole room and everybody, 2 minutes or 3 minutes or whatever, everyone gets some appreciation. And when we debrief it, the question I ask is, was it easier to give or receive? And universally, almost everyone says give. The receiving is more vulnerable. And some people will joke, I liked receiving, but the receiving is really nice. And I say, you probably won't forget anytime soon what people said to you. And I said, and one of the reasons it was so nice to give in the exercise, because you meant the things that you said. I gave you permission to actually go there. And the other person, because of the exercise, I gave everyone some coaching, just receive it and say thank you. Because in normal everyday life, people deflect and diffuse appreciation that comes their way because of some weird social norm. It ends up making it harder to give. If I gave you a present on your birthday and you were like, oh, you shouldn't have, or what's wrong with you? Or you threw it on the floor or you put it in I would be like, what is the matter with you, man? I just gave you a present. You would offend me. You would ruin the gift and I probably wouldn't give you any more gifts. But if you received it and said, wow, Mike, thank you. That's so thoughtful. I'm really touched that you gave me a present. Then all of a sudden, we both get to win in that exchange. And I'm more likely to want to give you another gift because it's not just a gift for you. It's a gift for me too.
Yeah. So Mike, you've done a lot of work with a lot of companies. Is there a particular example or a story that you always pull out of your back pocket when you're giving a keynote speech about appreciation and or authenticity?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few. I think, one that comes to mind just as you're asking this is a number of years ago, I was speaking to a big insurance company and they had a bunch of divisions and sort of presidents that ran the different divisions. And this was a number of years ago. And I got invited to speak at an event for the president of one of the divisions and his top sort of 60 leaders. It was to kick off the year and they'd had a really bad year the year before. And they brought me in and they were like, hey, they need some motivation. They're kind of, and Jack, the president, old school guy, no nonsense. They were coaching me, the HR person was coaching me, not too touchy feely. He wants the science and the data, how do they perform better? And I'm sitting there, right in the back of the room, Dean, and you've probably had this experience before. And I'm using my intuition, right? I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh man, these people are really stressed out. And Jack's up there kind of hammering on him. We got to do better. And and I'm like, man. And the thing in my back of my mind is these people could really use a good cry is what I'm thinking. But then the other voice in my head is no crying. There will be no crying. They told you, right? You talk to Jack, you know the deal, stick to the script, stick to your slides, whatever. So I'm wrestling with myself. I get up to speak and I have about an hour, maybe hour and a half. And I'm taking them through some stuff and I'm going through my slides and I'm talking about positive psychology and talking about the data that shows how to get people to perform and all this stuff. I believe in this stuff. I've written about this stuff. I know this stuff is good, but about halfway through, I'm in my head, I'm this sucks. This is not what they need. And so I'm you know what? I'm just going to turn my slides off and I'm let's do something a little different. I have them pair up, talk about last year and how hard it was. Who helped you get through last year? Because I know it sounds like it was rough. And, and so I have them pair up and talk about that. And then we start talking about appreciation and how we can be authentic and vulnerable and how we can, and we go through this whole thing. And I take it in a very different direction. And it does get a little touchy feely. I'm kind of looking at the HR person out of the corner of my eye. I'm watching Jack, the president. He's not looking very happy at the whole thing. But I'm you know what? I'm just going to go with this. And I get done. And at the end, there was a story I wanted to tell. And it's the story about my mom. And, my mom had passed away, but it's a story of appreciation related to her that I often tell about. I wrote a story for Chicken Soup for the Soul many years ago about my mom, and she didn't know. And then the book came out and I gave it to her as a gift. And it's a sweet story, but it often is the type of story that in the right moment, people will get a little emotional when I tell the story. And I've done this long enough. I'm oh man, if I tell this story right now, there's going to be some emotion in this room. And I'm like, the hell with it. I'm just going to do it. So I tell the story. Everybody in the room's crying, just about. Not Jack, though. And then I'm like, oh, shit. Right. So I get done and he comes up to like, the meeting's over. I'm the end. He's going to wrap it up. He doesn't look at me. He doesn't shake my hand. It's super awkward as I'm like, oh God, pissed. What happened? I go sit down and then he's like flustered and he's pacing back and forth. And I'm like, what's going on? And then he starts telling the story. He's like, when Mike asked us to pair up and talk about who helped this last year, he's like, he started talking about a mentor of his. And he shared with the whole group that he wanted to quit. It was so bad in the previous year that like things got so bad he wanted to quit. And he said, I'm so grateful for my mentor because he coached me and he helped me. And as he's talking about this mentor of his and how much he means to him, Jack started to cry. And I could tell just the little bit I knew about Jack. I'm like, he's not a crying kind of guy. Like this is a thing, right? And I'm looking around and people in the room are kind of shocked. And then it ends. And as I get up, the head of HR who had invited me to speak, she grabs me by the arm and she pulls me into the hall, sort of behind the door. And she looks me right in the eyes and she goes, 6 years. He's been in this role and we've been waiting for him to show up like that. And he finally did it today. And I was like, whoa. And again, I didn't show up thinking I wanted to make Jack cry or anything. I just showed up with my thing. And like this to me, and this is why, like, I've always tried to use my intuition as much as possible. I don't like to have too much material or content when I come in, even though this stuff matters to me. I'm always about the people in the room, what's going on, what's happening. And back to what you and I were talking about even before we hit record, I feel like today, these days, there's so much coming at everybody, all of us, and there's so much chaos flying around. It's harder than ever, I think, to trust our intuition, but it's more important than ever because it's literally, again, without sounding corny about it, I feel like it's what the world needs right now.
I agree. I agree.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's good to learn about AI. It's good to learn about as many things as possible. It's good to keep up with all the things. So we're like, but man, sometimes I'm so down the rabbit hole on so many different articles and videos and content, my brain starts to hurt. And then I stop and go, wait a second, Mike, you know how to connect with other humans. Like put your phone down, turn your computer off and go connect with the real humans in front of you. Like that's what's take off your shoes and go walk in the grass in the backyard and remember, like, you're a human being, you're on the planet. You know what I mean? And I do think we have to figure out how to balance that if we're really going to lead at this moment in history.
You know, you talk about intuition. I think that that's an incredibly important point because, at least in my experience, I think that intuition connects you to a certain part of yourself around a certain knowing, a certain wisdom, and there's solace in that. There's confidence in that. And then it also, among other things, provides you this access to a lot of other information and a lot of other people. So all of a sudden, when you started to get into this intuitive flow, you kind of go, wait a minute, I'm not alone. I've got all sorts of support. I've got all sorts of resources. And I've been operating like it's all up to me because I'm a doer. I'm a, get her done kind of guy, right?
Right.
I get into my intuitive thing. I get relaxed. And I love your story about being able to pivot with your facilitation because I tell clients that up front, just even put it in the SOW if you want. It's not going to go exactly the way we plan. Weddings don't, nor do good facilitation. So let's just be open to that. So long as we follow the value, we follow the honesty, we follow the authenticity. Are you okay with that? Then I'm going to pivot where we need to. And when we do, we always come out on top.
Completely. And I think like for facilitation, leading workshops, speaking, those types of things that you and I do, but just in general, because not everybody necessarily does that, but trusting that process. I learned this as an athlete. I mean, now we talk more about it, getting into a flow state or getting into the zone. When I was coming up in the 80s and the 90s playing baseball, people weren't talking about that. Was this weird thing. But I had that experience many times as an athlete. I couldn't quite describe it. I didn't know what it was, but it was incredible. And it was this sense of like stepping through some kind of weird portal in the matrix. And all of a sudden, everything slowed down. And it was like, oh my gosh. I remember pitching one time down at UCLA, and I struck out 8 out of 9 hitters in a 3-inning stretch. And I was just like, what is happening? And baseball is a very superstitious game because of all the and I remember coming into the dugout after that 3rd inning, and literally the rest of my teammates were like, don't touch him, don't talk to him, don't look at him, leave him alone. He's in. But I say that because, yes, there's the accomplishment part and the outcome part and the success part that we're obsessed with as a culture. But having done this long enough, both playing sports all those years, but then speaking, like there is that thing that happens. And even people who are completely agnostic to stuff like that or don't believe in stuff like that, it's like, we've all had that experience at times in life. You can't, and that's back to the death conversation. Weirdly, I really actually like talking to people who are in the early stages of grief. And I don't mean that masochistically, but what I know, what tends to happen is people are very undefended at that time, even if they're really in a lot of pain. And the veil seems thin, meaning like if you talk to people who've just lost someone, even if they're not someone, they'll start talking to you about love and God and rainbows. And I saw this cloud formation and that was, you know what I mean? All these things. And you're like, what the, okay. But to me, it's like, wow, it's like we bring in the mystical in those moments because we don't have any other way to describe it. And even people who consider themselves, atheists or agnostic to things like that, they just start dreams and things start coming to them. And they're like, I can't deny that. I don't know what that is, but something's happening.
Exactly. A good friend of ours who lost her husband several years ago to a boating accident. And I remember seeing her during that twilight time of grief, it was right afterwards. And she was the most vulnerable, clear, and powerful that I have ever seen her since or before. Now, I would never wish that kind of grief on anybody.
No.
But she tapped into something that was really remarkable. You mentioned the sports thing. I just wanted to tie back to that because I remember when I was a kid, my dad and I played tennis together. It was one of the things we did. And we would just go out, we'd drive northern Minnesota and we'd soon as we see a tennis court, we'd stop and it had usually cracks in the, in grass coming out of the court, but what the hell, it's going to make for an interesting bounce when we serve the ball. But we started reading this book called The Inner Game of Tennis, which was written back in 1974 by a guy named Timothy Gallwey. And if that didn't kind of get me to start thinking about that sort of flow state that you have when you're playing some sort of sport. And since then, I've done other sports, skiing and karate and so forth. But I always look at sports as being one of those anchor points that remind me what it's like to be in the flow, what it's like to be intuitive, because I can feel it physically and emotionally and probably even spiritually when you get into that. If I can bring that into facilitations, into coaching, into my marriage, into my relationships with other people, then maybe going back full circle here, Mike, all of this craziness that's going on around us, all these storms that are floating above our heads, they're still there, but we're not so freaked out by it.
Well, totally. I love that because I do think two things. One, if we stay connected to each other, I find, again, in the storm, if I know that I'm not all by myself and there's other people in it with me, that gives me a little bit of sense of safety and connection. We're going through it together. And that's where, again, we think about teams, we think about organizations. It's like, hey, there is this sort of metaphor of like same storm, different boats, right? We are dealing with it differently and different things happening, but can we link our boats up together and sort of head through the storm as a unit, as a group? And the truth is some of us boats are going to be taking on more water than others. So we're going to have a little more space and less. But the other thing that I find myself doing, because sometimes I don't know if this happens for you in your work, but I'll get brought in. And look, not everybody who is in a team or all the leaders I'm working with, not all of them think what I do and what I bring is important or valuable. Why are we doing this? We need to just get to we need to talk about the strategy. We need to, and what I often do, I respect and appreciate that because I also want the work that I do to be very practical and actionable, that it's not theoretical. But I often ask a very simple question when I'm doing some work with a team. I'll say, think about your best team experiences, the best teams you've ever been on in your career. What made those teams so great? Why were they great teams? Or sometimes we'll ask the question, if I'm talking about leadership, I'll say, who are some of your best leaders? What was it about them? But either way, either of those questions, usually the things that people say, almost 100% of the things that come out of people's mouth are very soft and squishy and intangible. We believed in each other. We had passion. We were committed to the mission. It's all this stuff that we trusted each other. It's never like, it was the best product I've ever seen, or everyone was wicked smart and went to the best schools in the country. It's none of that.
Really cool KPIs,
Yeah, exactly. The revenue was off the chart. No, having some success usually makes it more fun, clearly. But what I'm often trying to get to, and even I'm sitting in a group of engineers, or I'm sitting in a group of, lawyers or people in finance or whatever, the people that are the least likely to be into the sort of intangible aspects And that's the stuff that they talk about. Or the best leader, it's like, I trusted him or her, or she really believed in me. Or, it's never like, they were a Rhodes Scholar and their resume was off the chart. I mean, it's not that there's anything wrong with being really intelligent or well-educated, but like we've all worked for people who are very intelligent and well-educated and they're jerks and we don't trust them, or they say really rude, disrespectful stuff to us in front of other people. And it's like, I don't want to work for that person.
Yes.
I don't care how smart they are. I don't care if like they're the most talented person. It's like, when I think about sports, I always think about if your best player can be one of, if not the best teammate on the team, you're going to have a fantastic team. But if your best player is a jerk, if your leaders are jerks or don't care about people, it's not impossible, but it's really difficult to have a strong, healthy culture. Your best salesperson who thinks he or she like can do whatever they want because they're producing so much revenue, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And, you just got to hope that you got more Steph Currys than Barry Bondses on your teams, knowing the sports references, because like Steph Curry is one of the best players of all time in the NBA. And he seems to be, I'm a little biased because I'm from the Bay Area and root for the Golden State Warriors, but he seems to be an amazing human who's a great teammate. And it's like, everybody wants to play with him because he brings so much joy. And I'm like, that's the kind of superstar you want on your team, is someone who actually wants other people to have fun and be successful too.
You reminded me of the story you told about the client and getting vulnerable when he didn't expect it. I had a guy on this show about a month or two ago, and I'll share this little exercise with you and others because I thought it was really great to be able to ask in maybe, the right setting. But his name was, I think it was, let me just check here, Gerardo Sagate, and he was from this wonderful, do you know this guy?
No, it's a great name, though.
You were shaking your head. So he starts the interview with me during this podcast, and he says, he lives on the border between Switzerland and Italy, and he goes helicopter skiing on the weekend. And I went, oh my God, I'm already, enamored with your lifestyle. So he was off to the World Economic Forum in 2024, and I said, so Sagate, what are you doing? I mean, Gerardo, what are you doing there? And he goes, you're a facilitator, trainer, coach. I mean, what are you doing at this particular place? He goes, I'm trying to help people get their heart back as they talk about these world issues. And I said, how are you going to do that? And he says, well, I'm going to walk them through 3 questions. And he had a longer process to do this, but the 3 questions were, and he had people describe this to other people. One was, what is your dream? So people really had to tap into like, what is your dream? What's your purpose? Second question was, what is your fragility? I thought that was a good one too. And then the last one, which is pretty deep, which was, what is your apology? I thought, And so I've actually tried that a few times with some of our groups that we work with, and have them walk around and answer and give that information to other people in the room, and it really opens people up to the work, whatever we're doing. And man, Mike, I could talk with you all day, and I really wish that I could, but tell the audience here, really, where can connect with you? I know you got a new book out. Talk about that. Talk about how we can follow your work, and what's the best place to connect with you.
Yeah, I mean, the most recent book is called We're All in This Together, which is also the name of the podcast that I have. So that's a good place to check me out. But our website, mike-robbins.com, has info about me and my work and my TED Talks and all the things and ways to connect with me on social. So that's probably the best place.
That sounds great. Well, I wish you the best. This has been fascinating, and I really appreciate your work.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on, and I appreciate having this conversation.
Thank you for listening to Leadervation with Dean Newlund. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to learn more about Dean or Mission Facilitators Leadership, go to mfileadership.com. That's mfileadership.com, or check the show notes. Reimagine, facilitate, flourish. Transform your leadership success with Leadervation.